Wow, thank you. You made me sound important. Okay. I'm pretty chill, right? I'm pretty informal, so like everyone just like relax. Right, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. I actually think, Lucy, your bit about Black History Month and anti-imperialism, anti-racism, really hard act to follow. Maybe you should give this talk. All right, what I'm going to do is take you through a bit of the history of the Black Panther Party. Like Lucy kindly said, today is October the 15th. October the 15th is always both a wonderful and quite tragic day. Two reasons, right? The wonderful bit is this is the founding of the Black Panther Party. The tragic bit, if you're interested in Black history, is this is also the day where my hero, someone called Thomas Sankara, was assassinated. So that's something to think about beyond the lecture. You can Google who he was. Or maybe next year I'll come and give you a lecture on Thomas Sankara. All right, so today we're going to look at the history of the Black Panther Party. I kind of called the lecture What We Want, What We Believe, which was, you'll see, was the name of the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party. But I want to put this stuff into context of why you need to look at the Black Panther Party, why it's not just historical. So when I started to do research on the Black Panther Party, it's a long time ago now. It was about 10 years ago, right? I'm going to skip this long quote and I'm going to go here. It was around 2014, 2015. And does anyone know what was happening in 2014 in the US? Does anyone know? There were massive uprisings in places such as Ferguson, right? In Baltimore. You might have seen that on the TV. And in that period, there was a massive debate on the left about what was then anti-police struggle, calls to defund the police that would become far more prevalent 16 years later, because this was the first iteration of something called Black Lives Matter. What was happening there were these internal debates on the left about what this meant for anti-capitalism, right? So this long quote that we started with is by a very famous Marxist, a political economist called David Harvey, who, if you read this quote, kind of suggests, yeah, that's kind of good and all, but it's not really anti-capitalism, right? That's kind of what he suggests. What was interesting was, over the next year, there was like a full somersault of what was happening, right? So your first DNI president leaves, right? Comes to the end of his 2 terms. There was the rejection of white feminism. Do you remember that bit? And then there was this person, right? Now, I used to teach with these slides, and then I was like, oh, I took them out, but I'm putting them back in because, as you'll see, this is returned once more, even more orange and even more fascist, right? And we'll talk a bit about that towards the end of the lecture. But what is this key debate that we want to retrieve the Black Panthers for this context? Well, one is there's always a false debate about whether it's race or class. As this lecture will show you, this talk will show you, really it's about how race and class intertwine to produce capitalism, right? And in some ways, the race and class thing is a bit of a false debate. What we tend to see is a focus on class tends to kind of flatten ideas of intersectionality, but also sometimes forms of intersectionality flatten out class. And why I want to retrieve the history of the Black Panther Party is to show you that anti-racism is both anti-capitalist, it's anti-sexist, it's anti-everything other than liberation. And the Black Panther Party are a really good embodiment of that. And also I want to show you how the Black Panther Party's leader, Huey P. Newton, was not only a kind of key strategist, right, of anti-racism, but actually was a bit of a prophet about the way the world would turn, right? So theoretically, it wasn't just about guns or shooting out with the police. He understood the world theoretically from a kind of anti-capitalist position. Right, so when we think of race relations in the US, we tend to think of the kind of pivotal moment of the 20th century, which is a choice between two characters, right? This is Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King kind of pushes for civil rights, wants a kind of political solution to what is essentially Jim Crow or forms of apartheid in the US, right? On the other side is Malcolm X. Malcolm X is often narrated as the person who wanted revolution, wanted violence, wanted segregation, although that towards the end of his life, it's not very true. And you have these kind of two extremes, right? It's not really an extreme, because actually what you find is, towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King sounds a lot more like Malcolm X, right, than Malcolm X. Malcolm X never sounds like Martin Luther King. But essentially, it's a false divide between peace and non-peace. And the Black Panther Party are great because they show you how it was a false divide. So Black power emerges out of the schism between those two extremes, right? So in 1965, you have the emergence of the Civil Rights Act. You have the kind of start to formalize equality in the US, right? So the breakdown of what is Jim Crow, which is legalized segregation in the South, but also informal forms of discrimination in the North. This doesn't lead to Black liberation in the US though, right? And so from within the civil rights movement, people like Stokely Carmichael here start in 1966 to advocate for the idea of Black power. Now, Black power is quite an interesting kind of spectrum of politics, because it includes people who are Black nationalists, it includes people who are anti-capitalists, it includes people who are Pan-Africanists, and various groups. It includes also the Black Panther Party, but what's quite interesting is if you go and talk to ex-members of the Black Panther Party, some of them will say, we were never a Black power group, okay? It's quite interesting. But the most famous Black power group you will come across is what we call the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, founded not only by these two, but mainly by these two men. This is the person on the left, my left or your left, is Bobby Seale. And to his right is Huey P. Newton, who was the de facto leader of the group. So, as Lucy already pointed out, and we've kind of October 15th, 1966, the Black Panther Party is formed. It's a small group, really, in Oakland, California. And what it's kind of trying to do at that point is to raise community awareness. So the group's informed by various strands of thought. Malcolm X, Maoism, so China, communism, Frantz Fanon, and other kind of third worldist kind of ideas. But actually it's a very small localized institution in 1966. And it gets quite famous for what it calls, what became known as policing the police, which was essentially police brutality meant young African-American men, specifically in working class neighborhoods, would be targeted by the police, right? What the Panthers did was Newton and others realized that in California, you could actually, as long as you carried your firearm openly, you could walk around with it. And so what they would do is, when there was like a report of the police trying to brutalize African Americans, they would drive down, get out the car with their guns, and essentially observe, right? They would police the police. And then there would become these standoffs with the police going, well, you can't have guns. And they would say, no, actually, we know the law. We can have guns, right? And we're not going to shoot you, not unless you try to shoot us, right? And so that became quite a kind of powerful thing. But then things change. In 1968, there are two key moments that changed the Black Panther Party. Firstly, Martin Luther King is assassinated, right? And so people who saw Martin Luther King as a kind of democratic way to create Black liberation first find despair, but then find a bit of anger, right? And then secondly, one of the founding members of the group, little Bobby Hutton, is assassinated by the police in 1968. This catapults the Panthers into a kind of national consciousness. And the Panthers start to become a national organization. So they start off as a small community group doing policing the police, as we'll talk about a bit later, doing some community programs. But then other people in other bits of the city say, well, we'd like to become the Black Panthers. And you start to see more and more Black Panther Party chapters emerge across US cities, right? In this same time period, Huey P. Newton ends up in an altercation with the police, which leaves one policeman dead, himself shot, and he gets put in prison on murder charges, right? He's going to go to court and have a trial. And this creates what we call the Free Huey campaign, which again catapults the Panthers into the kind of core celebrity of the New Left. Yeah? So if you think about the New Left in the 1960s, the emergence or kind of cementation of feminism, of the ecology movement, of gay rights, of the kind of movement away from a stodgy version of anti-capitalism, the hippie movement, the anti-Vietnam movement are all kicking off. The Panthers kind of become like the cause that unites all of those things together. And in fact, they become, in some ways, the vanguard of the New Left entirely. So, when Newton is arrested in 1967 for the murder of an officer called John Frey, essentially the party becomes this really global cause. So like only a few years ago I was in Sweden, and Sweden had a whole solidarity campaign where Panthers would come and visit, but solidarity campaigns emerged across the Western world and even beyond the West. And so the Free Huey campaign creates a national and international campaign that really transforms the Panthers. And this is where you get the kind of iconography that's kind of popped up. And what were the Panthers doing during this period, right? So if you go and read what they were talking about, they were saying they were trying to organize brothers and sisters on the block, so poor African Americans, trying to kind of make them understand that they were the vanguard of the New Left, that it was the poor inner city African American who really was the vanguard of the New Left. And some people have called this kind of black against empire, trying to unite kind of localized spaces in very poor neighborhoods and bring them as a force against capitalism, right? And there were lots of things that the Panthers did that gave them a kind of symbolic spatial power, right, between the ghetto and global capital. So one of that was obviously policing the police. This is quite a famous moment from 1967. So the Panthers have been policing the police for about a year. And what then happens is, as you know, the state kind of tries to move against those activities. So what they do is they kind of create something called the Mumford Act, which changes the law around how you can do open carry in California. This is actually at the state capitol in Sacramento when this law is being read, and they send Bobby Seale down. One of the things the Panthers were really good at is understanding how to create a media event. So at this event, Ronald Reagan, right? Ronald Reagan is the governor of California at this point. He's going to become the president. And as I'm going to show you a bit later, he's going to kind of prove Huey Newton correct about what's going to happen to capitalism. But he's there giving this big press conference. And as he's giving it, Bobby Seale turns up. And as Bobby Seale leaves his car, all of the reporters just leave Reagan alone and head off to go and see Bobby Seale, right? And this is the other thing about this point, what the Panthers did. They understand that the left has to have a bit of aesthetic appeal, yeah? They have the leather jackets, they have the berets, you know, the left is sexy, right? Which sometimes the left has kind of forgotten, right? So forgot that a little bit. Right, the other thing they did was create a mediatic campaign. They had a newspaper, right? A newspaper that was generated and supplied across the nation. And it ran stories about what was happening in America, about racism in America, about police brutality, what the Panthers were doing, but it also ran international stories. And we'll come back to, you know, how the Panthers tried to create links between themselves and the internationalism. The Panthers also quite famously stood on a concrete 10-point program. You may have heard of this program before, right? This program essentially told you what the group was about, from housing to the economy to internationalism. What's interesting is that the 10-point program shifts as the Panthers change themselves. So on this one, which is from 1966, you can't see it actually here, but one of the things the Panthers ran on was the idea of giving African Americans a plebiscite vote on whether they should have their own nation, right? So the Black Panther Party starts as a sort of black nationalist organization. And this is a long-held idea in US black politics, that because of the way the majority of African Americans were brought to the Americas, that actually they didn't belong in the US and should have a separate state, right? What's interesting is as the Panthers evolve and become, in some ways, like a leader in Marxist thought, they sort of drop that. So if you compare this to the thing that I've got at home from 1971, 1972, there is nothing about a UN plebiscite anymore. And the other things they did was ran community programs, right? So many of you may have heard of the free breakfast for schools programs, but there were so many programs. I've got a whole manual at home about some of these programs. There was a free plumbing program. There was a busing your loved ones to visit people in prisons program. There was a clothing program, free food program, and of course, quite famously, free medical program, right? So medical centers run by Panthers, run by volunteer doctors who provided free healthcare, which in the US is still a huge, huge problem, right? The lack of free healthcare. And of course, there was then internationalism. At this point, the Vietnam War is taking right off, and the Panthers put themselves right in the middle of it, proclaiming allegiance with the Viet Cong fighting off US imperialism. They also were fans of what was happening in China. This is Huey P. Newton on a visit to China in the early 70s. He actually gets there before Ronald Reagan visits, just as China is trying to normalize relations with the US. And that kind of gives you a sense of what the Panthers were doing, right? Like that's the kind of history bit. But I'm not a historian. I haven't come to talk to you about history. I've come to talk to you about what they were doing both historically and theoretically and what they were trying to achieve. So, in the archives, when I was doing my own research, I come across this document. Now, this is quite an interesting document, right? This was in Huey P. Newton's archive, right? So it was stuff that he had and they kept, and then they put it in an archive at Stanford University, which is a very odd place to have the Black Panther Party's archive, if you know anything about Stanford University. But this is actually a very famous paper by a dependency theorist or sociologist called Immanuel Wallerstein, right? So Immanuel Wallerstein wrote tropes, a lot of material on the nature of global capitalism. And in it, if you read this document, it says, "Dear Huey, the framework of this analysis is very close to yours. I hope you enjoy it," right? And it's signed by someone called David. What's interesting is well, okay, so someone sent this very academic paper to Newton and said it was very close to his analysis, right? So some of you may have heard of Wallerstein's theory, but have you heard of Newton's theory? Probably not. So what we find during this time is Newton actually is unpacking a theoretical idea about global capitalism, and he gives it a really horrible neologism, right? He calls it intercommunalism, which is a bit of a mouthful. But what I want you to think about, when I use the word intercommunalism, what I want you to think about is the word globalization, which is itself equally bad, but not as bad, right? So think globalization. Every time I say intercommunalism, you think globalization. And what does this do? What Newton's thought starts to do during this period, which is late 60s heading into the 70s, is he starts to re-articulate what the Panthers should be about. He starts to talk about moving along from black nationalism and re-articulating ideas of black liberation. And he starts narrating the Panthers' trajectory from nationalism to internationalism to what he's going to call intercommunalism. And by 1970, the party is kind of rebranded as an intercommunal party, even if most people within the party didn't fully understand what Newton was getting at. And he starts to talk about something called reactionary intercommunalism. And when I say that, I want you again to think globalization, okay? I'm not going to read this quote out. But basically, Newton's idea is this, right? In the 1970s, what has happened is the US is no longer just a nation state, it's an empire, right? It's such a powerful empire that it can control and infiltrate most of the other nation states in the world through either trade or its military power. And if you think that's far-fetched, just Google how many military bases the US has today across the world. In fact, our British state just did a deal to keep something called Diego Garcia in the Chagos Islands, which you might have seen in the media. That's another US base. It's not really a UK one. Right? So they did the whole thing where they said, well, we gave the land back to the people. They didn't really do that, and they kept the military base. But there's hundreds of US military bases across the planet. But it's not just that. US multinational corporations, US kind of appreciation of the global economy, the institutions of the global economy, meant that the US really was an empire unrivaled in human history for Newton. And so Newton starts to say what's happening is global capitalism is changing because states can no longer really be sovereign. Yeah? Multinational corporations are using their kind of ways and means to make sure that even countries in what we call the global north, or what we used to call the first world, have no real sovereignty, and those in the third world, what we today call the global south, also have no sovereignty. And he goes really quite far. He says, well, US empire leads to the end of the nation state. And then goes even further and says the non-state that we want as anti-capitalists has actually been arrived at, but it's been arrived at through capital, right? Capitalism has created the non-state. And so what Newton starts to say is, well, capitalism's changing the way the world's going to look. He starts to say what we take to be, if we went back 40, 50 years, it was very simple. The global economy was set up like this, right? Manufacturing was in the first world, and everywhere else was like resources, whether that was human labor or material resources. It's quite simple, right? If you lived outside of the West, you were going to be agricultural, you were going to be poor, and you were going to be in a kind of state where you were dependent on consumption and manufacturing in the global north. That, for Newton in the 70s, is already starting to change. He starts to talk about Ford even opening plants in Russia to produce cars. And he's starting to predict what we in academia today call something called disarticulated Fordism, which is where multinational corporations outsource their production to different places, right? And he starts to say, well, the differences between the first and the third world, again, what today we call the global north and global south, will start to shift because they'll start to become pockets of very rich people in the third world. And the first world will start to see some of its living standards fall slightly, right? And then he says, why is this important, right? Because when he presents this theory, I have this great transcript of the first time he presents this, and then someone asks a question and swears at him and says, I don't care about Marxism, I don't care about capital, talk to me about racism, right? And he quite politely says, okay. Well, the reason this is key to racism is that what Newton says is this is going to disrupt the racialized settlement of the West, particularly the US, right? Because what's going to happen is, as this production moves, as we see changes in living standards, the racialized settlement of the US, where white people had access to really good, stable jobs, manufacturing, industrialized kind of jobs, will start to change. White people will start to feel poorer, right? Not only from their working classes, but all the way up to their middle class. And that the communities between the first, and at this point you have a second world, which was the organized communist world, and third world, would also start to feel impoverishment. So you'll see rising inequality in these various zones. Again, I'm not going to read this quote out for long, but it's the last bit where he says, this whole thing is happening, it's all happening, and then he says, even the populations of the Anglo-American Empire, that's the US, that's the West, itself are in the process of becoming nativized, right? He puts it in inverted brackets, and pauperized. So some of the colonial processes, which we thought were only really for non-white people, either outside of the West or even inside of the West, would start to become more prevalent in the core, right? And that would start to create more racial discord. Of course, Newton is a anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, so once he's narrated this change of global capitalism, he starts to say, well, we need to destroy it, right? We need to get rid of this empire. And he starts to locate black liberation within something he calls, again, it's kind of language issue, he calls revolutionary intercommunalism. And we just, for us, just think about revolution, right? It's revolution. And so what Newton starts to make really kind of apparent for his position on in the Panthers is the eradication of racism in America is tied up with global capitalism, right? Both revolutionary intercommunalism at home is tied with revolutionary intercommunalism abroad, and he starts to talk about the idea of liberating territory. Like, how do you fight this global force? Because you can't just go and have a revolutionary movement against the US state. And this becomes really important because at this very moment in the 1970s, right, Newton is allowed out of prison in the 1970s, mainly because of a technicality. He's not convicted of murder or manslaughter of Officer John Frey. He comes out of prison, right? And this is why this is all very important. He comes out of prison, and if you look at Black Panther Party rhetoric from 1966 to 1970, there's this idea that there's going to be a guerrilla war in the US, and that people are going to actually kind of defeat the US state. Yeah? And even when Newton's firstly kind of let out, he kind of says, yeah, we're thinking about it. Yeah, like we're thinking maybe it's going to happen. But, the US state and trying to defeat it might be a bit difficult. So he kind of, and we'll talk a bit later, it's going to lead to a split in the party, because there are some people who are like, we want war with the US state and we want to end it. And there are others who realize, I'm not sure we'll win, okay? But what Newton says is, well, we can liberate territory here, just as people are pushing back across the world at US empire in places like China, Vietnam, North Korea. These are all names that maybe you're a bit uncomfortable with thinking about, and I think it's interesting in the current moment thinking about how also the names of places that are pushing against US empire also may make us uncomfortable in a liberal situation, but we're kind of back in that moment. And what he starts to talk about is liberated territories, right? So China is a liberated territory at this point because China is not integrated into the global economy and is pursuing communist development. Angola is another space that he looks at. Or Mozambique, right? Mozambique has a liberation movement against Portuguese imperialism, has militarized kind of confrontations with Portugal. Some of you may not know that Portugal had a kind of decently sized empire, especially in Africa. And then they start to create their own kind of programs. What's called Frelimo starts to create their own programs of community kind of programs to kind of build the nation. And in an interesting kind of meeting, Newton meets the leaders of Frelimo from Mozambique in China in the early 70s. They're actually sitting down in the embassy. And when Newton sends someone to go and say, let's have a chat, the people from Mozambique originally say, no, we don't really want to talk to you because you're all about guns. You're all about violence. And then Newton gets up himself and kind of goes over and says, I think we should talk, right? And it actually creates a kind of relationship between the two groups moving forwards. But what Newton says is that this should kind of end the division of the people. You have a revolutionary moment, right? Like any good anti-capitalist, though, he doubts his own ideas are actually going to be true. And he starts to think about problems. And he says the problem is that reactionary intercommunalism, again, what I told you to think of as globalization, actually creates divisions rather than uniting the people. In fact, capital does that itself. That's what Newton would say, right? Across race, across class, across gender. And what's also going to happen is, as the global economy changes, as the state intervenes more to kind of facilitate those changes, the institutions and spaces that we used to resist these things in also start to change. So trade unions will become defanged. Our educational spaces will become more limited. Nation states themselves will have less power. If all of that sounds familiar, that's because Newton is kind of, before naming it, he doesn't know what it is. He's narrating what you and I call neoliberal globalization, right? He's talking about a neoliberal society. And what he says is that these conditions will ideologically and materially eviscerate, so they'll get rid of, the revolutionary potential of the people. And so what the Panthers are trying to do is organize the most oppressed in the US, which is the African American community for them, to save them materially and ideologically. How do you do that? Well, Newton starts to argue for something called survival pending revolution, right? Which becomes the kind of idea of the Panthers moving forwards. And this marks the kind of transition of the Black Panther Party, if we use Gramscian terms, right, from a kind of war of maneuver to a war of position. So I'll just give you a good explanation of what that is. A war of maneuver is where, let's say, and I'm not saying we should do this, but let's just say like we decided we didn't like the British state anymore. I don't know, I had some weapons and we all went off and had a little revolution, right? That you confront the state. A war of position is where you realize you can't do that and you build your strength and power in pockets of civil society ready to have an eventual war of maneuver. When this marks the transition of the Black Panther Party from saying we're going to take the state directly on to saying we need to build our strength to have a war of position. And so what the Black Panther Party do in Newton's vision is to start to create a counter-hegemonic apparatus across society through the community programs that can materially save the people, but also ideologically keep them going to be revolutionary. And these are the community programs, right? So the community programs get ramped out throughout the early 70s far more. So free breakfast for school children, we already talked about, schooling, medical centers, busing programs. What these kind of programs do is they not only just save people by feeding children before they go to school so they can perform well, they also show you alternative forms of life, right? Cooperative, anti-capitalist forms of life. Different ways of doing things, different ways of creating and running institutions. This is a great picture from one of the breakfast programs. You'll notice that they're not just feeding Black African American kids. In New York, they would feed poor white children, right? In fact, I've got a memo from the medical center in Oakland where the people running it have written back to the central HQ going, yeah, it's all going really well, but at the moment, we actually got everyone else but the African American community coming to use our services. I think we need to reach out a bit more, right? I'm not going to read that, it's too long. What this is in a sense of projecting sovereignty is what Nicole Palsing calls this. And what does that mean? Like I said, it means showing that the state isn't the only game in town, showing that capital isn't the only game in town, and by producing spaces that offer alternative visions of life, right? And in some ways, they become an existential threat to the capitalist way of life because they also cut across race, class, and gender, right? Where race and gender norms are subverted. It's really interesting. The Black Panther Party has a history of misogynism attached to it, which some of it is inherently true. But also, other bits of it are not true, right? So women run the party, as I'll show you in a bit. There's a counterintelligence program run by the US state called CONTELAPRO. Some of you may have heard of this. It was started first to target communists and then started to target black radicals. And the FBI run this program until the early 70s. It's a huge program. It took notes on everybody. You name them, the FBI had a file on them. From around 67 onwards or 68 onwards, the counterintelligence program focused specifically on the Black Panther Party to incriminate Panthers, to assassinate Panthers, and to subterfuge, create divisions in the party. I kind of did that slide. It's all run by this very evil guy called J. Edgar Hoover, which you may have heard of, who is one of the most evil people in US history. And the US has a big history of evil people, right? So this is J. Edgar Hoover. So in 1969, he says, the Black Panther Party, without question, represents the greatest threat to the internal security of the country, right? And you would think, well, why is that, yeah? And by this point, the guns thing, there's still guns going about, and there's still altercations with the police, but why is that? Well, if you dig into the archives, there are some really interesting documents. I am going to read this quote out because it's quite interesting. So, what the FBI started to do was disrupt the community programs, okay? So they would send operatives to either kind of disrupt the breakfast programs, disrupt medical centers. And so one of the FBI field agents writes back to J. Edgar Hoover, right? And he says, like, boss, I'm not really sure we should be doing this. Like, they're just feeding, like, children, yeah? Like, I don't see what's wrong with that. Okay? This is what J. Edgar Hoover writes back to that operative. He says, look, you must recognize that one of our primary aims in counterintelligence as it concerns the Black Panther Party is to keep this group isolated from the moderate black and white community which may support it. This is most emphatically pointed out in their Breakfast for Children program, where they are actively soliciting and receiving support from uninformed whites and moderate blacks. You state that the Bureau, under the CIP, should not attack programs of community interest, such as the Black Panther Party Breakfast for Children. You state this because many prominent humanitarians, both white and black, are interested in the program, as well as churches which are actively supporting it. You obviously missed the point. Yeah? And what he's doing there is slapping his operatives, saying, this is what we should be doing, right? Because they are bringing everyone together around a collective project. And we don't want that, because that's really dangerous. Never mind them with guns shooting out with the police. What's really dangerous is when you can bring people together in a space that offers a different way of life. So you have to destroy it. In my work, one of the things I've tried to say is, well, is there something more to this? Because if you understand what the FBI is doing, and if you understand what I've just narrated as Newton's theorization, then Newton's work on reactionary and revolutionary intercommunalism, the idea of survival pending revolution, does something really interesting to the history of what we think about when neoliberalism starts and who it started first for, and what are some of the remedies to it. Because if you understand what Newton's trying to orient the survival programs towards, then you can see actually the Black Panther Party as some of the first responders to what will become our norm, right? Where the state retracts, where our services are cut, where there is no kind of like safeguard. In some ways, the Panthers were already doing that because large bits of the black population in the US were already going through such processes, right? Of what we today call state abandonment. And in fact, you'll find this in the Panthers' work. This is, again, something from the archive, and it's a really interesting thing. This is actually a whole, it's like 40 pages. It's like a conversation between Huey Newton and Elaine Brown. Elaine Brown is going to rise up through the party and eventually run it in the late 70s as it's falling apart, to be honest. And it's just a take conversation between them. And what's really interesting is this note on the bottom. And it says this, right? And I think I'll read this one out. It says, the whole concept of transforming institutions, because as you stated here, and she's talking to Newton, because they've had a conversation, production is so decentralized that just as our ideological assault is difficult because of the factor of pinpointing the evil, the real assault cannot be, as many guerrillas suggest, and these are what she's referring to here, are people who would like to go to war with the US state, right? Made to destroy at the point of production, for it can hardly be identified. And then she talks about changing the idea of production. What's interesting is, right, this is, in 1972, a narration of our own problem, which is, it's very difficult for us as workers to go and lay claims to the means of production, because lots of the means of production no longer here, yeah? And so what she's saying is because the way global capital has changed, it's not like you can just go to one point and take it out. We're going to have to think differently, which shows you how kind of revolutionary their thinking was, because social science and the left in the UK isn't going to start doing this for like another 20, 30 years. So if we accept what the Panthers were doing, then, like I said, it changes the idea of the history of neoliberalism, who was narrating this first, who were first responding to this. And it also does something really interesting to how we think about how race and class are linked in the present. Because what the Panthers seem to suggest is, it's actually the practices on the margin, what happens to minorities, right? What happens to their lives, which then will be imported back into the lives of the many in the first world. And you can do this today on many a thing, right? Like, so if you want to look at how your lives have been securitized, you'll probably find that they were tried first on asylum seekers, yeah? Or they were tried first on people the British state didn't like, and then they come back into the core. And then this is really important, because what Newton's saying is, this is going to disrupt the way societies have been racially hierarchized, right? Where if you were white, you were generally all right. Or if you were white, you were poor, if you were a poor white, but you were never as poor as, say, your black or brown counterpart. Newton says that's going to change. And that shows you that neoliberalism is really, as much as it's an economic moment, it's also a racialized moment. It's a moment where racial capital itself changes. I've kind of done that. All right, that's kind of like what's going on in the 70s. What then happens, right? What happens afterwards? Well, what happens to the Panthers? Well, it's not good, yeah? The counterintelligence program essentially imprisons, incarcerates, and disrupts the party massively. In the early 70s, there's actually an ideological split between these two men, Huey P. Newton and someone called Eldridge Cleaver. So Eldridge Cleaver was not a founder of the Black Panther Party, but became very famous. He actually creates the first kind of foreign embassy that the Panthers had when he flees the US after little Bobby Hutton is killed and goes to Algeria. Some of you may have heard that. He goes to Algeria, sets up camp in Algeria, creates an international division of the Panthers. The Algerians at this point are still in their revolutionary moment and host them. But there's the counter-imperial program kind of creates this divide between those. Newton wants to do survival pending revolution. Eldridge Cleaver wants kind of all-out war with the US state. And they have a massive argument that happens on a radio program, and then there's a kind of mini war within the Panthers as the split happens. But as the Panthers start to become unravel because of the kind of interference of the US state, they become smaller. In the early 70s, Newton says to the whole membership, come back to Oakland. We're going to try and liberate Oakland first, and then forget your other cities. This leads to kind of members falling out of the party. What emerges out of the Black Panther Party at this point is something called the Black Liberation Army, which some of you may have heard of. The Black Liberation Army, this lady sitting here is probably its most famous member, is a bunch of radicals. This is Assata Shakur. Assata Shakur was wrongly imprisoned for, again, shooting a police officer. She flees to Cuba. But the Black Liberation Army functions from the early 70s into the early 80s as a sort of, I guess you would call it, paramilitary organization, attacking banks, assassinating police officers in order to create kind of a radical underground. For those of you about my age, their most famous kind of link is someone who's kind of linked to it is Afeni Shakur and someone called Mutulu Shakur. Afeni Shakur is the mother of Tupac Shakur, who will then become the biggest hip-hop star of the early 90s, right? This doesn't end well for them, obviously. The US state crushes them, right? And many of them were imprisoned right all the way through to a few years ago. So Mutulu Shakur, who quite famously did the Brinks Bank robbery, got caught, was only let out only a year and a half ago, and then he died of cancer. Huey Newton goes through a kind of roller coaster 70s, actually does a PhD in the early 80s, gets his PhD, but he's going to become a drug addict in the early 80s, even though he's still doing activism, and he's going to be killed in the late 80s. What's interesting is in 1980, Huey Newton receives his PhD in the summer. That year, Ronald Reagan runs a very successful program to become US president. Ronald Reagan creates the world of reactionary intercommunalism that Huey Newton had talked about. Yeah? He attacks trade unions in the US, he pushes through global trade with Margaret Thatcher and other key neoliberals, and he actually creates in full force what Newton thought was going to come. Right? And that goes on into the 90s and whatever. And you can see that's what happens towards global capitalism itself. This is, I'm going to see how long I've got left. I think I've got like 10 minutes, but I could be long. I've got 5. We can do it in 5. We're all good. This is what happens to global capitalism. This is how income has changed for the poorest people on the planet. That's number 1, to the top 1% all the way there. And you'll see from 1988 to 2008, that's all the way to the financial crisis, very rich people did really well, poorer people did okay, but everyone in this room who's belonged 16, 17, you would have seen your income stagnate. Yeah? Then for the last kind of decade, our incomes have sort of risen. Top 1%'s income has kind of gone down in how it's risen. They're still very rich. And the poorest people on the planet, some of them have come up. That's largely China developing itself. What's interesting is those changes have brought about what Newton thought would happen in most Western societies, right? As those convulsions have happened, our societies have become a bit even more nationalistic, even more xenophobic, and even more outwardly racist. In the US, of course, the best expression of that is not him, but the movement that he represents, right? Make America Great Again, Trumpism, kind of reformed white nationalism that can allow even crazy black and brown people into it as well, yeah, and women. Even though, I don't know if you saw a couple of weeks ago, there was a black Trump supporter at a rally who got attacked. And then the counter to all this is, as the US state has done all of this and neoliberalism has hit, on the back end of all of this, of course, has been the increased militarization of US policing, the imprisonment, the rise of imprisonment specifically of African Americans and Latinos in the US, and then the idea of police brutality, right, which then expresses itself in kind of Black Lives Matter, in both of its iterations, both in 2013-14, and I guess now the more famous iteration after the murder of George Floyd, in its second iteration. But there are changes afoot, right? And what I want to do for you is kind of update the story of what in an intercommunal analysis is happening. So if you look across the planet at the moment, Joe Biden is still trying to push through the interests of US empire, but in different ways. So Newton was kind of right? Capital moved across the world, we have multinational corporations, but what Newton couldn't foresee was that this system would actually create not alternatives, today we call it multipolarity, but there are other bits of power in the world, most namely China. China isn't really a competitor to US empire, but the US can't just rough-road China, right? So what you've seen in the last couple of years is Joe Biden has changed the US economic policy, not so big on all of the globalization, banning and pushing away Chinese corporations, trying to make US kind of really a world leader in green technology, which it's lagging behind. And you can see this in the kind of battle for the future, right? The top slide here is the US dollar. So most international trade is in US dollar. This is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. I've kind of put them as two things, but actually the dollar is still very, very strong, right? But the futures may not just be a US future. There are alternatives. Why is that important for us? Well, it's important for us because then what does that mean for anti-racism? And I want to kind of leave you with two main things from this lecture, right, that I think the Black Panther Party stood for. In this current moment, anti-racism, all right, if I was doing this lecture 4 years ago, I would all be joking to you about how everyone was now very big about D&I. Yeah, can you remember 2020? And like even university managers admitted that the world was racist. Do you remember that? Like 4 years ago, it was like really cool. You go in there And I used to be like the kind of anti-racist guy, and they were like, well, John's kind of been right about this stuff, right? And you would get all of these initiatives and all of these things. Well, that's kind of changed, right? Because they wanted us to decolonize the curriculum. But what's happened in Palestine, or what's happening in Palestine, has kind of brought to the fact the relationship between anti-racism and anti-imperialism. So whilst our students have been creating camps and asking for divestment, our university managers and the state itself have said, that's totally off the charts, guys. Like, we'll not give you that. At the same time, we see the increased repression and policing that we've been against again for the last decade. And we've also seen the global order itself kind of show its double standards, right? So US empire basically dictates to the world that, well, yeah, it's on one hand, what Russia's doing in Ukraine breaks international rules, but when it comes to Israel, we're not sure. And that's kind of put radical politics in this kind of situation. Well, what do you do when you're faced with this? Well, the reality is that the Panthers kind of show us a light about how anti-racism should pivot in the current moment. This is Newton meeting Yasser Arafat, right? I mean, ironically, I think his position on what should happen in the struggle is now outdated, but it's an idea of what anti-racism here is linked with those struggles abroad. Anti-racism here is not simply about inclusion into top jobs and board offices. It's about radical change for the people outside of the West. Whether that's Palestinian liberation, whether that's getting rid of extreme forms of poverty, whether that's sovereignty for global South states who want to industrialize and develop. And then also the Panthers speak to our current moment of abolition, right? So abolitionism is a very big kind of movement in the current movement where we want to defund the police, we'd like to abolish the police, we'd also like to abolish borders, we'd like to abolish everything that oppresses us and rebuild those institutions. The most famous advocate, I guess, for that is Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. What's interesting is the Panthers understood this as a global struggle, right? So abolitionism tends to sometimes be focused on our nation state here. What the Panthers' history shows us is if we want to think about creating institutions, then we have to think about how our institutional struggles are linked with others in the world, right? So how is the struggle against racism in, say, the US or the UK linked to the Indian farmers movement in India, or even what's going on with neoliberalism in Latin America, right? This is a great, that lady has that great sign of neoliberalism was born in China, will end in China. And she's pregnant at the time. You can't see it in that picture, but she's pregnant at the time, so it has like double meaning. How do we bring those struggles together? Well, the Panthers would say, you need to understand what's going on in the world to fully appreciate what's going on in the world. And then finally, and I think this is the big thing, right? The Panthers give us a sense of what anti-racism is as institution building. So lots of times, people will come to us and say, look, I'm an anti-racist, I want to do stuff. I want to kind of, I want to show anti-racist solidarity. That's great. But actually what we want to do as anti-racists is to create institutions. And what Newton and the Panthers give you is a way to be anti-racist and anti-imperialist through seizing your own community, right? And this is from I take this quote and I'll read it and then we'll end. This is from a conversation Newton has in Yale in 1971, right? And some of the students at Yale kind of are a bit kind of obnoxious to him, to be honest. And they ask him these questions, like, oh, well, what should we do? What should you do? And he basically says this. He says, look, we call it communism because at that point in history, people will not only control the productive and institutional units of society, but they will also seize the possession of their own subconscious attitudes towards these things. And for the first time in history, they will have a more than rather less conscious relationship to the material world. People, plants, books, machines, media, everything in which we live. They will have power, that is, they will control phenomena around them and make it act in some desired manner, and they will know their own real desires, right? That's Newton's idea of like a communist utopia, yeah? Sounds crazy, sounds out there, yeah? But this is the key kicker. The first step in the process is the seizure by the people of their own communities. So if you want to do anti-racism, and you're upset with the world, what the Panthers teach us is seize your community first. Build institutions, connect people, liberate each other. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.